Let's pause before we consider some things of Christ. Lord, we are in need of your words of life to us. We ask that your enlightenment would come upon us, that our responses would be to who you are today. In Jesus' name. Now let's see here. As we consider following Christ today, I like this picture. It's the gap between us and eternity is bridged by the cross of Christ, and he invites us to follow him. This is a picture by Nathan Green. He lives in Berrien Springs, Michigan, and I enjoy his artwork. If you go along the Dead Sea, you will find an arid, desolate countryside that has crystallized minerals along the edges of the sea. It's smelly, nasty territory. But alongside it are the caves. You can see a little cave there on the one protrusion where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm sure. And they have hit the news several times as more have been translated. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found there, and they are adjacent to a community called Qumran that has been excavated. It was a cultic area. People who lived there were isolationists. They withdrew from society, and they had their own writings, many of which were in the caves. And that's how we know about them. One of the things that they had, you can see this is kind of a sauna area. Actually, it was a ritual bath area where they would put water, and they would, from time to time, go down and dip themselves under the water for a ritual cleansing. They believed that by doing so, they would make themselves qualified to be with the angels who were going to be the soldiers in the apocalyptic war. So this was how they qualified themselves to participate in that. As we go up the center of Palestine, we come to the Sea of Galilee. This is I took this at the edge of a little town called Magdala. What does a name like that make you think of? Mary. Mary lived here. She's Mary Magdalene because of where she lived, Mary Magdalene. And they have excavated this little territory. The town wasn't found until the mid-1900s. It was very shallowly buried from a mudslide that had come down and many centuries ago, and they didn't bother with that area. And somebody bought the land and started to construct, and 6 inches below the dirt were all these rocks. The town of Magdala was found. And if you're there and you're looking out of it, the guide will tell you that there is still flowing today through this part of the waterway that they had back then to bring fresh water into the town. And in fact, what they have there is another one of these baths, just like we saw down in Qumran. This one was used for different purposes. In the life of the community in Israel, there were times when people needed to be having ritual cleansing. If you did something, if you had a certain kind of disease or a certain episode in your life, then you would go down. And this was in a residential area, and probably a wealthy person had provided this for his community around him. Otherwise of interest there, this is the only synagogue that has ever been found that can be dated to the 1st century. The only one all around Galilee. The better known one is at Capernaum, but it dates from the 4th century. This is one that would have been there when Jesus was there. And in fact, he probably walked here and taught here. the little benches on the side where people could sit, made of stone. Be glad for padded pews. Matthew chapter 4 says, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, healing every disease and sickness among the people. If he went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, and if he met Mary Magdalene, then it was here that he was also teaching in the synagogue that we saw from the first century there. Makes it rather interesting to think about that. Outside the little synagogue there is this urn, this stone basin, and it was filled with water. And before you went into the synagogue, you would do a ritual washing of your hands so that you would be clean to go into the synagogue. I noticed that we don't have one out here. It's not like our culture. We want to wash our hands, we go into the restroom, we use soap. There's no soap here. It's not about cleanliness. It's not about hygiene, and it's not about morality. It doesn't remove sin. It was a ritual that they used. And it was an interesting thing, interesting enough that Mark, as he wrote to whoever his audience was, talked about it. The Pharisees and teachers of the law from Jerusalem were around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eat with hands that were unclean, that is, unwashed. Now, this isn't about hygiene. The way you washed your hands properly was you took about a tablespoon of water and you put it in the palm of your hand. And if you were practiced enough, if you were deft enough with it, you could flip that around like this and get a drop back in your hand. And if you did, you had successfully cleansed your hand. You could now eat, go into the church, go whatever, So let's practice that, sometime of, a little water. See how spread you can get it around your palm. Ah, yes. I got new glasses this week. Now I'm having to readjust where my eyes are going to focus on me here. Okay. So, Mark continues to say, in parentheses here, the Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat without ceremonially washing their hands. When they come from market, they do not eat unless they wash. And in fact, it went on to their pots and pans. They observe other traditions such as washing cups and pitchers and kettles. It is not to get them clean. It's after you clean them, then you would do something to them so that you could put them back in your house because you had cooked something in it. Don't think of unclean meat as in those listed in Leviticus 11. Think of it as unclean because it was once alive and now it was dead and you cooked it to eat it. You had to clean up that deadness. So, if you're really a good Pharisee, you did more than just clean your pots and pans. You also did something else to them to make them ceremonially clean. The closest we have to this is the concept of holy water. This is a cathedral in Ghent, and I found it interesting because against the wall you can see the little basin where you put your finger and dabbed a little bit and you formed the sign of the cross. But over on the side they actually had an old container for it and a modern container for it where they could fill the holy water up, and nobody was looking, so I took a little bit and brought it home with me. I now have a little bit of holy water sitting on my shelf. But that's the closest that we have for it. Now, it may have started in the first century, in Old Testament times for sanitation purposes, but by the time of the first century, it had deteriorated into pure ceremonial ritual. The purpose for it was gone. They'd lost it. They weren't in the desert walking around anymore, and it had deteriorated. If you had incidental contact with life, you were now unclean, which is why the Pharisees had other people do their incidentals for them. You didn't shop for yourself, you had your servant do it so they could get all the uncleanliness. If you were a poor person or a lower class person, you had to do it yourself. And then you had to worry about whether or not you were now clean or unclean. The incidental contact with life. And so go to the store, go to the market, get something. You are now needing to be clean. It's kind of like, remember when you were a kid and you were afraid of getting cooties? You know, somebody near you might have cooties. You didn't want to sit where they sat. Spiritual cooties, okay? They don't exist, but you were afraid of getting them anyway. And the only way to get rid of it was the cultural, the ritual cleansing that came to it. Now, to our current times, at the Wailing Wall, I found this fountain with water. You could step on the pedal and water would come out, and you would put it in these pots, and you could see the people before they went to the wall. They would wash their hands ceremonially. And in the restroom, in the men's restroom, I didn't go in the women's, but in the men's restroom, they had the same things. You can see the little Hebrew written along the edges of it. So it's still a common thought in that part of the world. And it's not, to look at these things, there's so much more that meets the eye when you read a passage in Scripture. There is more understanding when we know something about the culture and the background. That makes a good story better. So now as we come to the story that we have today of Jesus, we have more understanding about what we're going to read. Let's go back to Magdala. This is in a residential area adjacent to that synagogue I showed you, and that is a street. It's a wide boulevard, isn't it? It's a big, wide street. All the traffic to the homes would go down that. People would go down it. This is what you would do when you left the synagogue. You go to your house. That's the kind of street you walked on. Nice, wide boulevard. Now, in this passage of Mark 5, there's two stories. One is inside the other. It covers quite a range of verses. We're not going to read them all. We're going to read some. Then we're say the story, tell the story, the rest of it, because it's familiar to us. And if not, then you can check up on me by reading it there. Perhaps it was in Magdala, maybe not. But it could have been, because Jesus had been to all of these synagogues. In this story, he's been to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and now he comes back. And I want you to note the connection in this story to the synagogue, maybe the one that we saw. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, meaning back from the other side of the lake to the side of to the western side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Magdala is right on the Galilee's shore. So he was by the sea. Then a teacher, a leader of the synagogue named Jairus came. The word there for leader, it's not just a leader. It could be the ruler. Many of them have ruler. Think head elder, okay? He's the one in charge of getting the speakers, of arranging things, who's going to do what. He's the one in charge. He's probably in the past arranged for Jesus to speak here, or to read, or to teach. That's what is his role, so he knows Jesus. And apparently he's been waiting for Jesus to come back from the other side, because he's here to meet him. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet. Very undignified for somebody of this type of role in the community. Very undignified for him to get down on his knees with Jesus. And he begged him repeatedly. Not something that would be common for someone of his position. My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Now his daughter is, Mark tells us, is 12 years old. He's very concerned about her. The heartfelt appeal of the father is coming out. He's disregarding his status to kneel and beg in front of Jesus. And I imagine that Jesus, wanting to meet people exactly where they are, probably got down on eye level with him. You don't need to kneel in front of me, but I'll join you. And that's what this artist has considered. So that Jesus is meeting Lazarus and Jairus and listening to his appeal to him. So he went with him. Jesus goes with Jairus. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Remember the size of the street? It's not very big. It doesn't take much to press in around somebody walking down a street like that. And if they're near the synagogue or coming from the sea into town, this is the size of the streets that they're walking on. The progress is slow. And Jairus is anxious. His daughter is dying. They probably have quite a bit of time yet in this slow traffic to get to his home. He's concerned. He's been waiting for Jesus. She's been sick a while. He finally has arrived, and now he wants to make sure Jesus gets there, and he's anxious. That's the story that we have. Now for the story in the story. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for how long? Isn't it interesting that she's had this issue of difficulty the same length of time as the girl has been alive? 12 years. 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather worse. It had grown worse in the time that she sought attention. And just imagine her own personal anxiety. We have considered Jairus' anxiety, consider hers. In Leviticus 15, verses 25 to 27, it tells us the ceremonial laws about her condition and similar settings. She was to have no contact with people. At home, she could not cook, and she could not eat her meals with other people. Now consider, if she had had children, she couldn't touch them as they grew up. For 12 years, if they were 4 years old, now they're in their late teens, probably moved out of the home, probably married. Everything that she touches is contaminated because she's contaminated by this blood flow. People avoid her on the streets, and that's difficult because the streets are so narrow. It's hard to avoid people. And so she has had social shame put upon her, personal shame because this won't go away, and she's ritually unclean. And her entire life resources have been depleted, and she's desperate. She'd heard about Jesus. Isn't that what it's all about? So that people hear about Jesus. Isn't that what we're here for? Isn't that what a Christian is about? Isn't that what a life of discipleship is? Not to call attention to ourselves, but to call attention to Jesus. She had heard about Jesus. Now I wonder what she'd heard. Do you think she'd heard that he was uppity and prejudiced and disdainful of people who were not following the ways of established religion? Or had she heard that he accepted the unacceptable like she was? Or that he had touched the untouchable, the lepers, touched the untouchable like she was. So maybe Jesus would be favorable to her. But the crowd is so thick, and she's not supposed to be there. She's got to be very careful about it. And so she forms a plan of intentional contact that is intentionally covert. And Mark goes through the process of telling us what went through her mind. I found it interesting that he would do that. He told us what she's thinking. But she forms a plan, and she says to herself, all I need to do is to reach out and touch the edge of his garment. Now, it's an interesting phrase that is used there. It could mean the hem, which might have been sewn up. It might have meant the strings that kind of are left over from the loom at the edge. Or it could have been a word that meant the tassels that were attached to each corner of his robe that were left there for a ritual purpose. Doesn't matter. All she needed to do in her own mind was to touch just the edge. She's at the edge. Just to touch the least amount of contact possible. She could touch that. And she would be healed. In her own mind, she believes this to be true. And so here's the crowd around her. She can't get to Jesus. The only way she's going to get down to even touch that little bit is to crouch down and reach between people's legs as they're walking very slowly down the path. To just reach in and try to touch that garment. And in that one touch was concentrated the entire faith of her life. She feels the cloth on her fingertips, and suddenly there's a vital surge of life flowing through her. And she knows, she's excited, she believes healing has happened. Now she just needs to withdraw her hand and sneak away from the crowd, and she can slip away uncaught. But Jesus stops. And he asks an absurd question. Remember that street? He says, "Who touched me?" Now his disciples are very rational. And they say, "What are you talking about? Look how many people are around you. Of course somebody touched you." He says, "No, that's not what I meant." And she stops as she hears Jesus' words, and she turns around and she sees him looking right at her. Her hand has been in the cookie jar. She got caught. And you know what she's thinking. You know what's going through her mind. He's going to be upset that I touched him. Oh, I didn't even think about it. I have now contaminated him, and he cannot now go and heal that little girl. I was so selfish. I was only thinking of myself. And now everybody's going to know about it because he knows about it, and he's stopped and he's coming around. And I'm going to be even more humiliated than I was. I wish I could go hide. There was a hole to crawl inside. And again, the shame takes over on her life. But she comes, she kneels down in front of Jesus, and she tells the story. How she has been sick for 12 years, how she heard he was here, how she came determined to just touch the edge. And having done so, she's found healing in her life, and she's whole. And she waits, trembling, for the condemnation that she knows is coming. And Jesus said, "Go in peace." Go in peace. But remember, there's a story within the story. There's Jairus standing right there by Jesus. Impatient because of the crowd, and now impatient because of the delay. And on top of that, he knows who this woman is, And now he knows that she's touched Jesus. And now Jesus is going to have to go find that bath and rinse himself in it. And according to the Levitical law, he cannot now be unclean until after dark. That's the quarantine period. He has to wait till dark. There's no way he's going to get to my home today, till tonight, to heal my little girl now. And you can imagine the distress that's in Jairus' mind. And while this is going through his mind as Jesus is talking to the woman, while Jesus was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from Jairus' home. All this has been going on in his mind, in the crowd, and with this woman. And Jesus has been delayed again till tonight. And he sees the messengers, and they say, "Your daughter is dead. Why bother the teacher anymore?" Do you think maybe Jairus needs a little dose of grace? The woman found some. Do you think Jairus needs a little dose of grace? He throws his hands up in despair. He's distraught. His daughter's dead. And to his amazement, Jesus says, "What are you waiting for? Let's go." And you can see in his mind, "But you can't come to my house. You're contaminated. You walk in my house is going to be contaminated. You can't come with me. My whole home, everybody in it, will be contaminated." But Jesus goes anyway. And when he gets there, he goes inside the house. And now he goes up to the dead girl and he takes her hand. Whoa! He's touched by a woman who has a hemorrhage. And now he touches a dead girl. He is going to have to take 3 baths. And my whole house is going to have to go through purification processes. He reaches out and he touches her hand. And in his own language, Aramaic, he says, "Little girl, rise up." And she sits up. She's alive now. And because Jesus touched her, she's alive, but she's contaminated. Did it matter that Jesus was contaminated? Did it matter? No, the woman was healed. Did it matter? The little girl is raised from the dead. Contamination does not stick to Jesus. You and me, with our living on this planet, and it's not just ritual down here, ceremonial, we have real sin going on around us in our lives, around us and in the community and everywhere on this planet. It's deteriorating fast. When we come to Jesus, we do not contaminate Jesus. It doesn't stick to him. No. Instead, virtue and righteousness come from Jesus to us. And we receive his grace. And in that process, he enters our human desperation, our human need beyond hope. We do not contaminate him. There is no fitness that we need to do beforehand. We don't need to wash ceremonially before we come to Jesus. We don't have to do certain practices to qualify us to be in His presence. We don't have to earn a certain amount of deserving to be with Jesus. We don't have to have eaten the right foods to be in His presence. We don't have to be a member of the right church or go on the right day to be in His presence. In one of the churches I pastored, there was another church nearby that had some folk in it that felt like they were in the true church, even though both of them were Adventists. And I got a letter from one of the people. She had visited, and, after 45 years since I first started preaching, I don't use pulpits. And I pace, sometimes more than others. And she wrote to me that I was a poor steward of the house of God because I was wearing the carpet out on the edge of the steps. And that in her church, where God really was present, we even have that kind of hierarchy, that some churches are holier than other churches. You don't have to be in one of those. You don't have to do this and that and the other to make ourselves fit to meet Jesus. You can be the woman. You can be the dead girl. You can be the concerned father who doesn't want you to come to his house anymore because you're going to contaminate it. Our closing song today is going to include this verse. Let not conscience make you linger, nor of fitness fondly dream. All the fitness he requires is to feel your need of him. It's in our hymnal, by the way. It's past the muster of the committee that selected the hymns. It was written in 1739. It was already, that's 385 years ago. 285 years ago. 285 years ago. It was already, that song was already 100 and some years old when these words were written. All the fitness he requires is to feel your need of him. Our only claim to his mercy is our great need. It doesn't say our only claim to his mercy is that we lived right and that we did things right and we ate right and we didn't sin anymore and we did, It says our only claim to his mercy is that we need him. Grace happened in that narrow street of Galilee. And grace is happening here today. To you. To me. You can slide away, hesitant, unsure, uncertain, that you qualify, that you're fit. Or you can come to Jesus and with just the slightest touch, wavering, stretching out, unseen, beneath the legs, through the legs of the crowd, just to touch Jesus, the hem of his garment. Let grace happen to you. Jesus says, come unto me. Benediction means blessing. And there is no greater blessing today than to hear these words that Jesus speaks to your heart and to mine. Please read with me. Go. Go in peace.